a Korean mafia boss, gave an unlimited black credit card to a homeless single mother and disappeared into the shadows. Less than 60 minutes later, his phone vibrated with a notification that defied everything he knew about power. It wasn't a jewelry heist. It wasn't a first-class ticket out of the city. It wasn't even a shopping spree at a luxury boutique. It was a transaction so small, yet so profound, that he knew his world was about to shift. In that moment, she didn't just spend his money. She made a choice that would dismantle his empire's philosophy and force them both to confront a truth that blood and billions could never hide. Ji-Hoon, the sharp-faced architect of a multi-billion-dollar criminal and corporate syndicate, operated on a single, lethal principle. Loyalty is a commodity, and everyone has a price. At 35, he had climbed to the top of the Seoul underworld by watching the pious crumble under the weight of a bribe and the noble betray their brothers for a seat at his table. His life was a curated collection of cold perfections, bespoke black suits, a penthouse that felt more like a glass fortress, and a bank account that could buy cities but couldn't buy a night of peaceful sleep. To Han, the world was a chessboard where the poor were merely desperate pawns waiting for a chance to steal the king's crown. His father, the man who built their blood-soaked legacy, had hammered the truth into him. Trust is a currency for the dead, Ji-Hoon. Give a starving man a crumb, and he will wait for you to sleep so he can take the whole loaf. For years, Han carried that cynicism like armor. Every charitable act was a strategic move. Every mercy was a calculated debt. He had never once looked into the eyes of the broken and seen anything other than a threat. But that rainy Tuesday, as he stood in the damp air of the station, looking at a woman holding a child with a teddy bear, the ice in his veins began to crack. He was about to set a trap to prove her greed, not realizing that by the end of the night, he would be the one begging for a different kind of salvation. The world Ji-Hoon lived in was sharp, cold, and very expensive. In the high-rise buildings of Seoul, people didn't talk about feelings. They talked about numbers. As the head of a massive empire, Han saw the city as a giant vending machine. If you had enough money or enough power, you could get whatever you wanted. He believed that every person had a price tag hidden somewhere on them. Some people would sell their secrets for a new car, while others would betray their best friend for a promotion. To Han, honesty was just a fairy tale told to people who were too poor to buy the truth. His office was at the very top of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds. Inside, the air always smelled like expensive leather and cold rain. Han sat behind a desk made of dark wood that cost more than a family home. He didn't have family photos or colorful art on his walls. Instead, he had monitors showing stock prices and maps of his territories. He was only 35 years old, but his eyes looked like they had seen 100 years of shadows. He was a master of reading people. He could look at a man's shaking hands and know exactly how much money it would take to make that man lie in court. This belief wasn't something he picked up on his own. It was a gift from his father, a man who had built their name out of grit and iron. His father used to tell him that the world was divided into two groups, the hunters and the prey. Never trust a person who has nothing, his father would growl, swirling a glass of dark liquid. They are the hungriest wolves of all. They will smile at you while they hide a knife behind their back. Han had lived by these words like they were the law. He stayed alone in his glass fortress, protected by his bodyguards and his billions, certain that everyone was out to get something from him. But lately, the billions felt heavy. He had 3 vacation homes he never visited, and a fleet of cars he never drove for fun. He was the king of a kingdom made of ice. Every morning, he put on his perfectly tailored black suit and tied his black tie with steady fingers, preparing for another day of moving pawns on his chessboard. He felt like he was walking through a desert, even though he was surrounded by luxury. He was waiting for something to prove him wrong. Or perhaps he was just waiting to prove he was right one last time. He didn't know that tonight, in the middle of a crowded, dirty station, his father's truth was finally going to be put to the ultimate test. The subway station was a world away from Han's quiet glass tower. It was loud, damp, and smelled of old coffee and cold metal. Han stood near a concrete pillar, his tailored black coat making him look like a dark shadow against the dirty white tiles. He was waiting for his driver, but his sharp eyes were already busy scanning the crowd. He watched people rushing by, their heads down, completely ignoring the world around them. To Han, these people were just busy bees in a hive, working hard for tiny bits of honey. That was when he saw them. Tucked into a dark corner, away from the main path, sat a woman and a small child. The woman, Tasha, looked like she was made of exhaustion. Her deep brown skin was dull under the flickering station lights, and her hair was messy and tangled. She wore an oversized grey jacket that was covered in stains and holes. She looked like someone the world had tried to erase. In her arms, she held a little girl named Danielle. The child was about 8 years old, with soft curls and a peaceful face that didn't seem to belong in such a harsh place. Danielle was fast asleep, her small hands clutching a worn teddy bear that had seen better days. Han stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly on the floor. He looked at Tasha's teary, stressed eyes and felt a surge of his father's old cynicism. He saw the homeless and hungry sign resting against her knee and wondered if it was all an act. He looked at his own reflection in a nearby window. The clean-shaven face, the perfect side part in his hair, and the sleek black credit card tucked inside his pocket. The contrast was almost painful. He was the king of the city, and she was a ghost, living in its basement. Tasha looked up, her face tight with fear as she saw the serious man in the expensive suit staring at her. She pulled Danielle closer, her arms acting like a shield. She didn't ask for money, she just watched him with a look of bone-deep sadness. Han felt a strange prickle of curiosity. According to his father, this woman would do anything for $1. She was supposed to be dangerous and greedy. But as he looked at the sleeping child and the mother's protective grip, he started to wonder. He reached into his coat and pulled out the black card. It felt heavy in his hand, like a weapon. He was about to start a game that would prove who she really was, but for the first time in his life, he felt a tiny flicker of hope that he might be wrong. Han reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rectangular piece of plastic. It was deep black and had no spending limit. To most people, this card represented a dream life, but to Han, it was just a tool to prove a point. He crouched down so he was at eye level with Tasha. The cold air of the station swirled between them, but Han didn't flinch. He held the card out between 2 fingers, the gold chip glimmering under the dim station lights. Tasha stared at it as if he were holding a live coal. "I have a challenge for you," Han said, his voice as smooth as silk and just as cold. Tasha's grip tightened on Danielle, her knuckles turning pale. She looked confused and terrified, waiting for the catch. Han continued, "This card has no limit. You can buy anything you want for the next 24 hours. Food, jewelry, a car, or even a ticket to another country. I won't stop you, and I won't call the police." He watched her face closely, looking for the flicker of greed his father always talked about. He expected her eyes to light up with the thought of stealing his fortune. Tasha's voice was a shaky whisper. "Why? Why would you do this for someone like me?" Han almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He didn't tell her about the bet he had made with his rival, or that he was using her like a lab rat to prove that everyone is a thief when they get the chance. "Let's just say I'm curious," he replied. "In 24 hours, come back to this exact spot and return the card to me. If you're still here, I might believe that honesty actually exists." He pressed the card into her rough, trembling hand. The moment their skin touched, Tasha shivered from the coldness of his touch. She looked down at the card, then at her sleeping daughter, and then back at the man in the $1,000 coat. Han stood up and adjusted his tie, his face returning to its serious, calm mask. He didn't give her instructions on how to use it. He knew the world would teach her that. Without another word, he turned his back on her and walked toward the exit where his black sedan was waiting. As he stepped out into the rain, he pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. He was ready to watch the numbers fall, certain that by morning, Tasha Reynolds would be just another person who had proven his father right. Back in his glass tower, Han sat in total silence. The city lights below looked like tiny diamonds scattered on black velvet, but he didn't care about the view. His eyes were locked on the glowing screen of his phone. He had set a special alert for the black credit card. He expected the phone to start buzzing any minute with huge numbers. He imagined Tasha running to the nearest jewelry store to grab gold necklaces or heading to a car dealership to buy a fast, shiny vehicle. That was what his father's world had taught him to expect. An hour passed, then two. The penthouse felt colder than usual. Han paced back and forth on his soft carpet, his hands tucked into his pockets. He felt a strange mix of boredom and excitement. To him, this was a game, and he was sure he knew how it would end. He thought about the other men in his circle. They all believed that everyone had a breaking point, a moment where they would throw away their pride for a pile of cash. Han was waiting for Tasha to reach hers. He kept refreshing the screen, his face lit up by the pale blue light of the app. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in his palm. A notification popped up. Han held his breath, his thumb hovering over the screen. He expected to see a charge for thousands of dollars at a luxury hotel or a fancy department store. Instead, the screen showed a small amount from a local pharmacy. A few minutes later, another alert appeared from a grocery store. The amounts were so low, they were almost embarrassing to a man like Han. He frowned, his sharp eyebrows drawing together. He stayed up all night, watching the phone like a hawk. Every time a new alert came in, he analyzed it. He saw charges for a pair of thick socks, a heavy blanket, and a bottle of children's vitamins. There was no gold. There were no expensive watches. There was no attempt to flee the city. Han leaned back in his leather chair, feeling confused. The high-rise around him felt like a lonely island. He was surrounded by millions of dollars, yet he was mesmerized by a woman spending $30 on medicine. He began to feel a knot of anxiety in his chest. For the first time, the truth his father had taught him was starting to feel like a lie, and Han wasn't sure if he was ready for the world to change. The sun began to rise over the city, but Han had not moved from his chair. The light was pale and thin, casting long shadows across his expensive wooden desk. He stared at the list of transactions on his phone, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. He had spent his whole life watching people spend money to show off or to hurt others. He knew exactly how a greedy person acted. But the list on his screen didn't make any sense to him. The first few receipts were small and quiet. There was a charge from a tiny shop near the station for a carton of warm milk and a simple sandwich. Han could almost see Tasha sitting on the cold floor, carefully feeding her daughter Danielle, while the rest of the world was still asleep. Then a new notification appeared from a local pharmacy. It wasn't for expensive perfume or fancy makeup. It was for a bottle of children's antibiotics and a pack of Band-Aids. Han realized that while he was busy thinking about his bet, Tasha was busy trying to stop her daughter's cough. As the morning grew brighter, one more alert popped up. It was from a thrift store just a few blocks away. The amount was less than what Han usually spent on a single cup of coffee. He used his computer to look up the store's inventory and saw what she had bought: a small, fluffy teddy bear and a pair of sturdy winter boots for a child. Han looked at his own shoes, which were made of the finest leather and polished to a shine. He had enough money to buy every toy in the city, yet he hadn't felt true joy in years. These silent receipts were speaking louder than any of his father's lectures. Han had expected a heist, but he was witnessing a rescue. Tasha wasn't trying to change her life. She was just trying to make sure her daughter survived the day. He felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. For 35 years, he believed that everyone had a price, and that the poor were the most dangerous because they were the most desperate. But Tasha had his unlimited fortune in her hands, and all she wanted was a teddy bear and some medicine. The cold, hard wall he had built around his heart was starting to crumble, and for the first time, the billionaire mafia boss felt like he was the one who was truly poor. Exactly 24 hours after Han had first held out the black card, he returned to the station. The air was still damp, and the lights still flickered, but Han felt like a different person. He stood by the same concrete pillar, checking his expensive watch. To his surprise, his heart was beating a little faster than usual. Part of him still expected to be stood up. He expected Tasha to be miles away, living in a fancy hotel or running from his guards. After all, his father had always said that no one gives back a fortune once they have it in their hands. Then he saw her. Tasha was walking toward him through the crowd. She looked just as tired as before, but her back was a little straighter. Danielle was walking beside her, wearing the new winter boots and a thick, warm coat that was still bright and clean. Danielle's small hand was tucked into her mother's, and she was hugging her new teddy bear tightly. They stopped right in front of him. Tasha didn't look away this time. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her stained jacket and pulled out the black card. She held it out to him. Her hand was steady. "You told me to bring it back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Han took the card, and for a moment, they both held on to it. The plastic was warm from being in her pocket. Han looked at her, searching for any sign of regret or trickery. He saw nothing but honesty. She hadn't kept it for a single minute longer than he had allowed. She hadn't tried to hide it or sell it. She had followed his rules exactly, even though she had nothing to her name. "You could have stayed away," Han said, his voice sounding less like a boss and more like a curious man. "You could have spent 100 times more than you did. Why did you come back?" Tasha looked down at Danielle and then back at Han. "Because I want my daughter to know that being poor doesn't mean being a thief," she replied. "And because you trusted me when no one else would." Han felt a sharp sting in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed of the test he had created. He realized that while he had the billions, Tasha was the one with the real power. She had done the unthinkable. She had chosen her dignity over his money. Han slowly put the card in his pocket, knowing that the game was over, and he had lost in the best way possible. Han took the card, but Tasha didn't leave right away. She reached into her pocket one more time and pulled out a small, wrinkled piece of paper. "I almost forgot," she said, handing it to him. "This is the last receipt." Han took the paper, expecting it to be for more medicine, or perhaps a bus ticket. But as he smoothed out the wrinkles and read the name at the top, his breath caught in his throat. It was a receipt for a $100 donation to a local kitchen that served dinner to the homeless. Han stared at the paper, his mind racing. He looked at the total and then looked at Tasha's worn-out jacket. $100 was nothing to a billionaire, but to someone living in a train station, it was a fortune. It was the difference between sleeping on a floor and having a warm bed for a week. "Why did you do this?" Han asked, his voice cracking for the first time. "You have nothing. You and your daughter are sleeping in the cold. Why would you give money away to strangers?" Tasha looked at Danielle, who was busy showing her teddy bear the flickering lights of the station. "When we were at our lowest, a man at that kitchen gave us his last loaf of bread," Tasha explained softly. "He didn't have a black card. He didn't even have a coat. He just saw that we were hungry and he helped. I told myself that if I ever had the chance, I would pay him back." She wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "I didn't want to just take from you, Mr. Han. I wanted to do something good with what you gave me." Han felt a wave of emotion hit him, like a physical blow. For 35 years, he had been taught that the poor were dangerous because they were desperate. He believed they would claw and tear at anyone to get ahead. But Tasha had just proven that the most desperate people could also be the most generous. She had used his wealth to heal a wound he didn't even know existed. He looked at the receipt, then at the small family in front of him. He realized that his father's gospel was a lie designed to keep him lonely. Tasha hadn't just returned his card, she had returned his humanity. He realized that he couldn't let them walk away back into the shadows. For the first time in his life, Ji-Hoon didn't want to be a hunter. He wanted to be a protector. The engine of Han's black sedan hummed quietly as they drove away from the train station. Inside the car, the air was warm and smelled like expensive leather. Tasha sat in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, looking out the tinted window at the city she usually saw from the sidewalk. Beside her, Danielle had finally fallen back asleep, her head resting against the soft seat and her teddy bear tucked under her arm. Han sat in the front, watching them through the mirror. For the first time, he didn't feel like a boss watching a deal. He felt a strange, heavy weight in his chest, a feeling of responsibility. They pulled up to a tall building in a quiet, safe part of the city. It wasn't his glass tower, but it was just as beautiful. The lobby was filled with bright lights and fresh flowers. Han led them to the elevator and took them to the top floor. When the doors opened, he led them into a large apartment with big windows and soft, white carpets. "This is yours," Han said simply. Tasha stood in the middle of the room, looking at the high ceilings and the comfortable furniture. She reached out and touched the back of a velvet sofa, her fingers trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you doing all of this?" Han walked over to the window and looked out at the streetlights below. In his world, territory meant land you fought for and people you controlled. But as he looked at Tasha and her daughter, the word started to mean something else. He realized that they were now his territory, But not because he owned them. He wanted to protect them because they were the only real thing in his world of fake smiles and lies. "My father told me that the poor were dangerous," Han said, his voice deep and steady. "But I was the one who was dangerous. I was living in the dark, and you showed me the light." He turned back to her and saw a look of peace on her face that he had never seen before. Danielle had wandered over to a large, soft bed in the next room and climbed in, still wearing her new boots. Han felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. He knew his rivals would think he was getting soft. He knew his enemies might try to use this against him. But for the first time in 35 years, he didn't care. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had found something worth more than billions. He had found a family to protect, and he was ready to fight the whole world to keep them safe. Word traveled fast through the dark streets of the city. The other bosses were whispering that Ji-Hoon had finally lost his mind. They heard he had moved a homeless woman into a luxury building and was spending his time checking on a child instead of counting his gold. Han knew what they were saying, but for the first time in his life, their opinions felt like dust in the wind. He walked into his glass tower, but he didn't head for the stock market monitors. He called his top advisors into the room and sat them down at the long, dark table. "Everything is changing," Han said, his voice sounding like cracking ice. "We are moving our money out of the shadows. No more fear, no more hurting people to make $1. His advisors looked at each other with wide eyes. They were used to a boss who only cared about winning at any cost. But Han stood up and paced in front of the giant windows. He thought about the small donation receipt Tasha had given him. He thought about how she had helped a stranger even when she was starving. If a woman with nothing could be that brave, then a man with everything had no excuse to be a coward. He began to dismantle the blood and billions empire piece by piece. He closed down businesses that made people's lives miserable and started putting his money into things that actually mattered. He bought old, crumbling apartment buildings and turned them into clean, safe homes for families who were sleeping in the rain. He opened centers where mothers could get medicine for their children without having to worry about the cost. His father had taught him that the poor were wolves, but Han was realizing that most people were just sheep who had been left out in the cold for too long. It wasn't easy to change a mafia empire. There were people who tried to stop him, and there were nights when the old cynicism tried to creep back into his mind. But then he would think about Danielle's new teddy bear, or the way Tasha looked at him with honest eyes. He wasn't just building buildings, he was building a new version of himself. He was no longer the hunter, and he refused to let anyone else be the prey. Ji-Hoon was still the most powerful man in the city, but now that power had a heartbeat. He had a new mission, to make sure that no one else had to wait for a miracle in a dirty subway station just to feel like a human being again. 2 years passed like a beautiful dream. The city still had its tall glass towers and its busy streets, but for Ji-Hoon, the world felt much warmer. He stood in the doorway of a bright, cheerful building in the heart of the neighborhood. A large sign over the door read, "The Ji-Hoon Foundation." Inside, the air didn't smell like cold rain or expensive leather anymore. Instead, it smelled like fresh cookies and floor wax. He could hear the happy sounds of children playing and the steady hum of people talking about their futures. Tasha Reynolds stood at the center of the room, looking like a different person. She wore a neat, professional suit, and her eyes were bright with energy. She was no longer a ghost in a subway station. She was the director of the community center. She moved through the hall with confidence, helping a young father sign up for job training, and giving a warm hug to a mother who had just found a new apartment. When she saw Han, she gave him a wide, honest smile. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep sense of friendship. Danielle was there too, no longer a tired child sleeping on a concrete floor. She was 10 years old now, running around with a group of friends. She still carried a teddy bear, but it was a new one, and she only held it because it made her happy, not because it was the only thing she owned. She ran up to Han and gave him a quick high five before disappearing back into the crowd. Han watched her go, and he felt a quiet joy that no amount of money could ever buy. Han looked at his hands. They were the same hands that used to count blood money and sign cold contracts. But now, those hands built schools and funded clinics. He realized that when he handed Tasha that black card 2 years ago, he thought he was making a bet on her life. He thought he was the one giving her a gift. But as he watched the community thrive around him, he knew the truth. Tasha was the one who had saved him. She had rescued him from a life of expensive emptiness. She had shown him that being a leader meant serving others, not ruling them. His father had been wrong about everything. Trust wasn't a currency for fools. It was the foundation of a real life. Ji-Hoon was still a billionaire, but he finally understood what it meant to be rich. He wasn't just a boss or a hunter anymore. He was a man with a purpose. And as he walked beside Tasha to start the day's work, he knew that his investment in her had paid the greatest profit of all. It had given him back his soul.